Hi, I'm Terike Haapoja, very happy to be here tonight. I'm a visual artist and I'm going to talk about 3 projects that look at what happens to our social institutions when they clash with the new human-nature relationship that we're confronting. The challenge of representational democracy has always been the issue of how to include those who are silent or silenced. And we know from historic and contemporary struggles that exclusion is always lurking in the shadows of democracy. But the environmental crisis brings this challenge to a more fundamental level. What happens when our notion of community starts to expand so that we're forced to recognize the agency of other forms of life? What happens if we start to think of democracy not as a power of people, but as a site where everybody who is present is heard? What, of course, becomes apparent is that the majority of those who are present in the community are excluded from political decision-making processes. Those who take care of the fundamental processes of our society, from food production to circulation of water and oxygen, to providing raw materials, shelter, medicine, have no say about things that concern them. Party of Others is a proposal for a political party that would represent all the silenced and the voiceless in the society, namely the non-human world. Questions arise, of course. Who, then, is present? Who should be counted? How can we listen to those who will never be able to speak our language? How can we include those who don't even want to be included? What kind of governance could manage such diverse relations, language, and needs? And, of course, who is qualified to talk on behalf of them? I put these questions to a group of leading environmentalists, philosophers, activists, and politicians, and the answers often contradicted each other. Should we isolate ourselves from nature in the future, or should we live in closer proximity to it? Should we have a binding global legislation, or should decision-making be scattered in small, local, interspecies communities? The resulting discourse that was presented in a gallery exhibit reveals that the anthropocentrism of our systems of governance, with its emphasis on the ability to be able to voice one's concerns, opens a door for a certain kind of skepticism. We can always say that we don't know what they want. And based on this premise, we give ourselves license to do nothing, or what's even worse, to do anything. But they're not going to change and start to speak to us. We will have to start to listen. So based on the interviews I conducted, I wrote an agenda for an actual real political party and launched the campaign for registering it in the official party register. The agenda presents a radical ecocentric model which proposes both realistic goals, such as having a representative for animal welfare issues in the parliament, as well as very utopian visions, such as mandatory syllabus of interspecies communication taught in schools. That would be great. It advocates a paradigm shift in our society, which paradoxically would also deconstruct the exact system of which it is now part and radically renew democracy. Now, modern law divides the world into 2 categories, that of persons and that of things. Legal persons are humans and human-made constructs such as states and non-profits like Creative Time. They can have basic rights and they can own stuff. Stuff, which is things, and includes pretty much everything else, including nature and animals, can only be owned. They can be killed, they can be destroyed, but they can't be victims of a crime. History of Others is a collaboration between myself and writer Laura Gustafsson, and it challenges the anthropocentrism of our world through reimagining social institutions. In 2013, 3 wolves were poached in central Finland. The officially recognized victim of this crime, however, was not the wolves, but the state whose hunting laws were offended. So when the poaching case went to court, we organized a simultaneous reenactment of that case, but because we felt that the laws were outdated, we amended them. So what happens if the wolves were to be considered legal persons with basic rights? What kind of rights would those be, and how would that change the verdict? Would compensations be paid to the remaining 2 wolves of the pack, for instance, in the form of safety zones from hunters? And not kind of surprisingly, the jury that consisted of members of the audience ratified the new legislation with no problem at all, and for those few hours this new law was a reality. Now, if we wish to stop climate change and mass extinctions and the whole environmental crisis, something like this will have to be the future. Already in 1972, a lawyer called Christopher D. Stone argued that if corporations can be legal persons, also non-human entities should be and could be represented in courts. 40 years later, finally, the case for the rights of nature is starting to get a foothold. Ecuador and Bolivia have included the rights of nature in their constitution, and just last month, or I think in July, New Zealand granted legal personhood to a national park. Many of these initiatives are led by indigenous scholars and activists who are really at the front line of this progress. What non-human legal personhood would mean, of course, is not that they would have human rights, but that there would be tools to recognize the victimhood of non-human beings and entities and hold violators, like corporations, for example, responsible while compensating damages directly to the victims as restoration or freedom or protection. We're so accustomed to the idea that rights is something that belongs to humans that it's hard to think otherwise. But the reverse side of this construct is the category of the non-human. Non-human as the other without rights, as the one who is present but not seen, as the one who has only instrumental value, as the one who can be killed but cannot be a victim. If we want to protect humanity, we need to question this boundary. Not only are human rights and rights of nature intertwined, but this line itself has throughout history been used as a tool for justifying abuse and oppression of some for the benefit of the ones in power. And as a fundamental construct in Western thought, this boundary has effectively used to serve white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, as we know. Museum of Non-Humanity declares this boundary to be history. It's an imaginary and real museum that's based solely on archival images, quotes, and encyclopedia entries, and displays a history of the construction of otherness through dehumanization, the rhetorics of dehumanization that always precedes structural violence. Museum of Non-Humanity is a memorial site for contemplating these narratives as if they were now in the past. The museum's archive of Western rationalization makes it apparent that the abuse of the environment is justified based on the exact same rhetorics as the abuse of humans, that the othering of the non-human world creates conditions where othering in general becomes possible. How are we then to build a world beyond this hierarchy? How can we build a world that recognizes the freedom and dignity of all humans, and that also has the capacity to value and respect life in all its richness? To probe this future, the Museum of Non-Humanity hosted an extensive series of lectures and seminars led by local and international activists and professionals who discussed indigenous perspectives, gender diversity, the science of empathy, animal rights, post-humanism, and decolonization of sites of knowledge. It's difficult to talk about rights of nature at a time when human rights are under siege in so many fronts. But the struggle for rights of nature and the struggle for social justice are the same struggle. Nature is our ally in the fight against the forces that seeks to exploit people, land, nature, and other creatures merely as a resource. In her lecture on non-human legal personhood, the anthropologist Elisabeth Povinelli describes imagination not as something that has to do with the imaginary, but as pulling into existence. Our social institutions are simply unfit for the challenges that we're facing today. Occupying these forms make the premises of which they're built on negotiable and opens spaces where radically new order can be imagined. By collectively imagining beyond the impossible, we can temporarily transform our current reality also into a place where all kinds of ways of being are acknowledged. And with that, hopefully pull the future a little bit closer. Thank you.
So I'm curious, what planted the seed for this idea for you? In terms of how you conceptualize this whole system, kind of where did the idea generate?
I guess it just comes from living in the world and understanding that you have to somehow confront these issues. I guess the original notion came from the idea that we work through gallery practices and we have all these ideas of hybridity and human nature relations and so on. But in the area of legislation, there is a very strict divide into two worlds. And that's the divide that's really, really difficult to cross because it's so deeply embedded in our culture. But it's something that we have to start to think around if we really want to have kind of an environment that has the capacity for social justice and also climate justice. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.